Hello, everyone. We will be returning to The Shining today, starting about halfway through chapter 14, and continuing on for, you know, however long that, probably, about 2 hours usually is the plan, but we'll see how the chapters round out. I figured it would be appropriate if I put on some snowstorm ambience, which I found on YouTube. Let's see if we can't get some. I had some pulled up, but it says it's no longer available. So let's find some on the fly. Ooh, there you go. That should do. So, if you remember, we picked up on chapter 14. Jack Torrance was redoing the shingles on the roof. He got stung by a wasp, and he was talking about how being a victim of a wasp stinging was making him feel like he was using it as a metaphor for what it's like to have a temper like he does. You know. Give me 1 second here. I gotta make sure that I have done all the proper prep to be free to do this. I've freed up all the space to store this recording and stuff. Both having a temper and being an alcoholic. He talks about how alcoholism runs in his family, so he doesn't really feel like he's got a lot of agency when it comes to that. So does having a temper, and he compares losing his mind and doing something like hurting someone to being swarmed by wasps. He says your instincts take over. The thing he says that I highlighted here was, um, you cease to be a creature of the mind and become a creature of the nerve endings, from college-educated man to wailing ape in 5 easy seconds. That was actually the last sentence we read, so I'm going to pick up with the next sentence now. He thought about George Hatfield. Tall and shaggily blond, George had been an almost insolently beautiful boy. His tight-fitted jeans and Stovington sweatshirt with the sleeves carelessly pushed up to the elbows to disclose his tan forearms. He'd reminded Jack of a young Robert Redford, and he doubted that George had too much trouble scoring, no more than that young football-playing devil Jack Torrance had 10 years earlier. He could say that he honestly didn't feel jealous of George or envy him for his good looks. In fact, he had almost unconsciously begun to visualize George as the physical incarnation of his play hero, Gary Benson, the perfect foil for the dark, slumped and aging Denker, who grew to hate Gary so much. But he, Jack Torrance, had never felt this way about George. If he had, he would have known it. He was quite sure of that. George had floated through his classes at Stovington. A soccer and baseball star, his academic program had been fairly undemanding, and he had been content with C's and an occasional B in history or botany. He was a fierce field contender, but a lackadaisical, amused sort of student in the classrooms. Jack was familiar with the type, more from his own days as a high school and college student than from his teaching experience, which was at second hand. George Hatfield was a jock. He could be a calm, undemanding figure in the classroom, but when the right set of competitive stimuli was applied, like electrodes to the temples of Frankenstein's monster, Jack thought wryly, he could become a juggernaut. In January, George had tried out with 24 others for the debate team. He had been quite frank with Jack. His father was a corporation lawyer, and he wanted his son to follow in his footsteps. George, who felt no burning call to do anything else, was willing. His grades were not top end, but this was, after all, only prep school, and it was still early times. If should be came to must be, his father could pull some strings. George's own athletic ability would open still other doors, but Brian Hatfield thought his son should get on the debate team. It was good practice, and it was something that law school admissions boards always looked for, so George went out for debate, and in late March, Jack cut him from the team. The late winter inter-squad debates had fired George Hatfield's competitive soul. He became a grimly determined debater, prepping his pro or con position fiercely. It didn't matter if the subject was legalization of marijuana, reinstating the death penalty, or oil depletion allowance. George became conversant, and he was just jingoist enough to honestly not care which side he was on, a rare and valuable trait, even in high-level debaters, Jack knew. The souls of a true carpetbagger and a true debater were not far removed from each other. They were both passionately interested in the main chance. So far, so good. But George Hatfield stuttered. This was not a handicap that had even shown up in the classroom, where George was always cool and collected whether he had done his homework or not, and certainly not in the Stovington playing fields, where talk was not a virtue, and they sometimes even threw you out of the game for too much discussion. When George got tightly wound up in a debate, the stutter would come out. The more eager he became, the worse it was, and when he felt he had an opponent dead in his sights, an intellectual sort of buck fever seemed to take place between his speech centers and his mouth, and he would freeze solid while the clock ran out. It was painful to watch. So I think we have to say that the facts in this case, Mr. Dorksey cites, are rendered obsolete by the recent decision handed down in. The buzzer would go off, and George would wheel around to stare furiously at Jack, who sat beside him. George's face at those moments would be flushed, his notes crumpled spasmodically in one hand. Jack had held on to George long after he'd cut most of the obvious flat tires, hoping George would work out. He remembered one late afternoon about a week before he had reluctantly dropped the axe. George had stayed after the others had filed out, and then had confronted Jack angrily. "You set the timer ahead." Jack looked up from the papers he was putting back in his briefcase. "George, what are you talking about?" I didn't get my whole 5 minutes. You set it ahead. I was watching the clock." "The clock and the timer might keep slightly different times, George, but I never touched the dial on the damn thing. Scout's honor." You did!" The belligerent, I'm sticking up for my rights way George was looking at him had sparked Jack's own temper. He'd been off the sauce for 2 months. 2 months too long, and he was ragged. He made one last effort to hold himself in. "I assure you I did not, George. It's your stutter. Do you have any idea what causes it? You don't stutter in class." "I don't stutter." "Lower your voice. You want to get me. You don't want me on your goddamn team." "Lower your voice," I said. "Let's discuss this rationally." Fuck that." "George, if you control your stutter, I'd be glad to have you. You're well prepared for every practice, and you're good at the background stuff, which means you're rarely surprised. But all that doesn't mean much if you can't control that." "I've never stuttered," he cried out. "It's you. If someone else had the debate team, I could—" Jack's temper slipped another notch. "George, you're never going to make much of a lawyer, corporation or otherwise, if you can't control that. Law isn't like soccer. 2 hours of practice every night won't cut it. What are you going to do, stand up in front of a board meeting and say, now, gentlemen, about this tort?" He suddenly flushed, not with anger, but with shame at his own cruelty. This was not a man in front of him, but a 17-year-old boy who was facing the first major defeat of his life, and maybe asking in the only way he could for Jack to help him find a way to cope with it. George gave him a final, furious glance, his lips twisting and buckling as the words bottled up behind them struggled to find their way out. "You set it ahead. You hate me because you know. With an articulate cry, he had rushed out of the classroom, slamming the door hard enough to make its wire-reinforced glass rattle in its frame. Jack had stood there, feeling, rather than hearing, the echo of George's Adidas in the empty hall. Still in the grip of his temper and his shame at mocking George's stutter, his first thought had been a sick sort of exultation. For the first time in for the first time in his life, George Hatfield had wanted something he could not have. For the first time, there was something wrong that all of Daddy's money could not fix. You couldn't bribe a speech center. You couldn't offer a tongue an extra $50 a week and a bonus at Christmas if it would agree to stop flapping like a record needle in a defective groove. Then the exultation was simply buried in shame, and he felt the way he had after he had broken Danny's arm. "Dear God, I am not a son of a bitch. Please." That sick happiness at George's retreat was more typical of Denker and the play than of Jack Torrance the playwright. "You hate me because you know..." Because he knew what? What could he possibly know about George Hatfield that would make him hate him? That his whole future lay ahead of him? That he looked a little bit like Robert Redford and all conversation among the girls stopped when he did a double gainer from the pool diving board? That he played soccer and baseball with a natural, unlearned grace? Ridiculous. Absolutely absurd. He envied George Hatfield nothing. If the truth was known, he felt worse about George's unfortunate stutter than George himself, because George really would have made an excellent debater, and if Jack had set the timer ahead, and of course he hadn't, it would have been because both he and the other members of the squad were embarrassed for George's struggle. They had agonized over it the way you agonize when the class night speaker forgets some of his lines. If he had set the timer ahead, It would have just been to put George out of his misery. But he hadn't set the timer ahead. He was quite sure of it. A week later he had cut him, and that time he had kept his temper. The shouts and threats had all been on George's side. A week after that he had gone out to the parking lot halfway through practice to get a pile of source books that had been left in the trunk of the VW. And there had been George, down on one knee with his long blonde hair swinging in his face, a hunting knife in one hand. He was sawing through the VW's right front tire. The back tires were already shredded, and the bug sat on the flats like a small, tired dog. Jack had seen red and remembered very little of the encounter that followed. He remembered a thick growl that seemed to issue from his own throat. "All right, George, if that's how you want it, just come here and take your medicine." He remembered George looking up, startled and fearful. He had said, "Mr. Torrance," as if to explain how this was all just a mistake. The tires had been flat when he got out there, and he was just cleaning dirt out of the front treads with the tip of his gutting knife he just happened to have with him. And Jack had waded in, his fists held up in front of him, and it seemed that he had been grinning. But he wasn't sure of that. The last thing he remembered was George holding up the knife and saying, "You better not come any closer." And the next thing was Miss Strong, the French teacher, holding Jack's arms, crying, screaming, "Stop it! Jack, stop it! You're going to kill him!" He had blinked around stupidly. There was the hunting knife, glitting harmlessly in the parking lot asphalt 4 yards away. There was his Volkswagen, his poor old battered bug, veteran of many wild midnight drunken rides, sitting on 3 flat shoes. There was a new dent in the right front fender, he saw, and there was something in the middle of the dent that was either red paint or blood. For a moment he'd been confused, his thoughts, "Jesus Christ, Al, we hit him after all," of that other night. Then his eyes had shifted to George lying dazed and blinking on the asphalt. His debate group had come out and they were all huddled together by the door, staring at George. There was blood on his face from a scalp laceration that looked minor, but there was also blood running out of one of George's ears, and that probably meant a concussion. When George tried to get up, Jack shook free of Miss Strong and went to him. George cringed. Jack put his hands on George's chest and pushed him back down. "Lie still," he said. "Don't try to move." He turned to Miss Strong, who was staring at them both with horror. "Please go call the school doctor, Miss Strong," he told her. She turned and fled toward the office. He looked at his debate class then, looked at them right in the eye because he was in charge again, fully himself, and when he was himself there wasn't a nicer guy in the whole state of Vermont. Surely they knew that. "You can go home now," he told them quietly. "We'll meet again tomorrow." But by the end of that week, 6 of his debaters had dropped out. 2 of them the class of the act, but of course it didn't matter much because he had been informed by then that he would be dropping out himself. Yet somehow he had stayed off the bottle, and he supposed that was worth something. And he had not hated George Hatfield. He was sure of that. He had not acted, but had been acted upon. "You hate me because you know..." But he had known nothing. Nothing. He would swear that before the throne of Almighty God, just as he would swear that he had set the timer ahead no more than a minute. And not out of hate, but out of pity. 2 wasps were crawling sluggishly about on the roof beside the hole in the flashing. He watched them until they spread their aerodynamically unsound but strangely efficient wings and lumbered off into the October sunshine, perchance to sting someone else. God had seen fit to give them stingers, and Jack supposed they had to use them on somebody. How long had he been sitting there, looking at that hole with its unpleasant surprise down inside, raking over old coals? He looked at his watch. Almost half an hour. He let himself down to the edge of the roof, dropped one leg over, and felt around until his foot found the top rung of the ladder just below the overhang. He would go down to the equipment shed where he had stored the bug bomb on a high shelf out of Danny's reach. He would get it, come back up, and then they would be the ones surprised. You could be stung, but you could also sting back. He believed that sincerely. 2 hours from now the nest would be just so much chewed paper, and Danny could have it in his room if he wanted to. Jack had had one in his room when he was just a kid. It had always smelled faintly of wood smoke and gasoline. He could have had it right by the head of his bed. It wouldn't hurt him. "I'm getting better." The sound of his own voice, confident in the silent afternoon, reassured him, even though he hadn't meant to speak aloud. He was getting better. It was possible to graduate from passive to active, to take the thing that had once driven you nearly to madness as a neutral prize of no more than occasional academic interest. And if there was a place where the thing could be done, this was surely it. He went down to the ladder to get the bug bomb. They would pay. They would pay for stinging him. That's the end of chapter 14. I'm having a little bit of computer troubles here, so I want to take a quick break. Okay. I'm getting a message. Hold on. Okay. Chapter 15. Down in the front yard. Jack had found a huge white painted wicker chair. Oh my god. In the back of the equipment shed 2 weeks ago, and had dragged it around with the porch over Wendy's objections that it was really the ugliest thing she had seen in her whole life. He was sitting in it now, amusing himself with a copy of E.L. Doctorow's Welcome to Hard Times, when his wife and son rattled up the driveway in the hotel truck. Wendy parked it in the turnaround, raced the engine sportily, and then turned it off. The truck's single tail light died. The engine rumbled grumpily with post-ignition and finally stopped. Jack got out of his chair and ambled down to meet them. "Hi, Dad," Danny called and raced up the hill. He had a box in one hand. "Look what Mommy bought me." Jack picked his son up, swung him around twice, and kissed him heartily on the mouth. "Jack Torrance, the Eugene O'Neill of this generation, the American Shakespeare," Wendy said, smiling. "Fancy meeting you here so far up in the mountains." "The common ruck became too much for me, dear lady," he said, and slipped his arms around her. They kissed. "How was your trip?" "Very good. Danny complains that I kept jerking him, but I installed the truck once and... Oh, Jack, you finished it!" She was looking at the roof, and Danny followed her gaze. A faint frown touched his face as he looked at the wide swath of fresh shingles atop the Overleaf's west wing, a lighter green than the rest of the roof. Then he looked down at the box in his hand, and his face cleared again. At night, the pictures Tony had showed him came back to haunt in all their original clarity, but in sunny daylight, they were easier to disregard. "Look, Daddy, look!" Jack took the box from his son. It was a model car, one of the Big Daddy Roth caricatures that Danny had expressed an admiration for in the past. This one was the Violent Violet Volkswagen, and the picture on the box showed a huge purple VW with the long '59 Cadillac Coupe de Ville taillights burning up a dirt track. The VW had a sunroof, and poking up through it, clawed hands on the wheel down below, was a gigantic warty monster with popping bloodshot eyes, a maniacal grin, and a gigantic English racing cap turned around backwards. Wendy was smiling at him, and Jack winked at her. "That's what I like about you, Doc," Jack said, hitting the box back. "Your taste runs to the quiet, the sober, the introspective. You are definitely the child of my loins." "Mommy said she helped me put it together as soon as I could read all the first Dick and Jane." "That ought to be by the end of the week," Jack said. "What else have you got in that fine-looking truck, ma'am?" She grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "No peeking. Some of that stuff's for you. Danny and I will take it in. You can get the milk. It's on the floor of the cab." "That's all I am to you," Jack cried, clapping a hand to his forehead. "Just a dray horse, a common beast of the field. Dray here, dray there, dray everywhere." "Just dray that milk right into the kitchen, mister." "It's too much," he cried, and threw himself on the ground while Danny stood over him and giggled. "Get up, you ox," Wendy said, and prodded him with the toe of her sneaker. "See," he said to Danny, "she called me an ox." "You're a witness." "Witness, witness," Danny concurred gleefully, and broad jumped his prone father. Jack sat up. "That reminds me, Chumley, I've got something for you too, on the porch by my ashtray." "What is it?" "Forgot. Go and see." Jack got up, and the two of them stood together, watching Danny charge up the lawn and then take the steps to the porch 2 by 2. He put an arm around Wendy's waist. "You happy, babe?" She looked up at him solemnly. "This is the happiest I've been since we were married." "Is that the truth?" "God's honest." He squeezed her tightly. "I love you." She squeezed him back, touched. Those had never been cheap words from John Torrance. She could count the number of times he had said them to her, both before and after marriage, on both of her hands. "I love you too." "Mommy, Mommy!" Danny was on the porch now, shrill and excited. "Come and see! Wow, it's neat!" "What is it?" Wendy asked him as they walked up from the parking lot, hand in hand. "Forgot," Jack said. "Oh, you'll get yours," she said, and elbowed him. "See if you don't." "I was hoping I'd get it tonight," he remarked, and she laughed. A moment later he asked, "Is Danny happy, do you think?" "You ought to know. You're the one who has a long talk with him every night before bed." "That's usually about what he wants to be when he grows up, or if Santa Claus is really real. That's getting to be a big thing with him. I think his old buddy Scott let some pennies drop on that one. No, he hasn't said much of anything about the Overlook to me." "Me either," she said. They were climbing the porch steps now. "But he's very quiet a lot of the time. And I think he's lost weight, Jack. I really do." "He's just getting tall." Danny's back was to them. He was examining something on the table by Jack's chair, but Wendy couldn't see what it was. He's not eating well either. He used to be the original steam shovel. Remember last year? They taper off, he said vaguely. I think I read that in Spock. He'll be using two forks again by the time he's 7. It stopped on the top step. He's pushing awfully hard on those readers, too, she said. I know he wants to learn how, to please us. To please you, she added reluctantly. To please himself most of all, Jack said. I haven't been pushing him on that at all. In fact, I do wish he wouldn't go quite so hard. Would you think I was foolish if I made an appointment for him to have a physical? There's a GP in Sidewinder, a young man from what the checker in the market said. You're a little nervous about the snow coming, aren't you? She shrugged. I suppose. If you think it's foolish, I don't. In fact, you can make appointments for all 3 of us. We'll get our clean bills of health, and then we can sleep easy at night. I'll make the appointments in the afternoon, she said. Mom, look, Mommy! He came running to her with a large gray thing in his hands, and for one comic, horrible moment, Wendy thought that it was a brain. She saw what it really was and recoiled instinctively. Jack put an arm around her. It's all right. The tenants who didn't fly away have been shaken out. I used the bug bomb. She looked at the large wasp's nest her son was holding out, but would not touch it. Are you sure it's safe? Positive. I had one in my room when I was a kid. My dad gave it to me. Want to put it in your room, Danny? Yeah, right now! He turned around and raced through the double doors. They could hear his muffled running feet on the main stairs. There were wasps up there, she said. Did you get stung? Where's my purple heart? He asked and displayed his finger. The swelling had already begun to go down, but she mewed over it satisfyingly and gave it a small, gentle kiss. Did you pull the stinger out? Wasps don't leave 'em in. That's bees. They have barbed stingers. Wasp stingers are smooth. That's what makes them so dangerous. They can sting again and again. Jack, are you sure that's safe for him to have? I followed the directions on the bomb. The stuff is guaranteed to kill every single bug in 2 hours' time, and then dissipate with no residue. I hate 'em, she said. What, wasps? Anything that stings, she said. Her hands went to her elbows and cupped them, her arms crossed over her breasts. I do too, he said and hugged her. Okay, that's the end of chapter 15. That's a short one. Take a quick drink. I hope my performance is doing their banter some justice. I feel like I'm trying hard not to make it into Guardians of the Galaxy dialogue, but it's not easy. I like their dynamic, but I don't think I'm selling it very well. Let me check this message real quick. Okay. Chapter 16. Danny. It's just called Danny. Down the hall in the bedroom, Wendy could hear the typewriter Jack had carried up from downstairs burst to life for 30 seconds, fall silent for a minute or two, and then rattle briefly again. It was like listening to machine gun fire from an isolated pillbox. The sound was music to her ears. Jack had not been writing so steadily since the second year of their marriage, when he wrote the story that Esquire had purchased. He said he thought the play would be done by the end of the year, for better or for worse, and he'd be moving on to something new. He said he didn't care if the little school stirred any excitement when Phyllis showed it around. Didn't care if it sank without a trace. And Wendy believed that, too. The actual act of his writing made her immensely hopeful. Not because she expected great things from the play, but because her husband seemed to be slowly closing a huge door on a room full of monsters. He had had his shoulder to that door for a long time now, but at last it was swinging shut. Every key typed closed it a little more. Look, Dick, look. Danny was hunched over the first of 5 battered primers Jack had dug up by culling mercilessly through Boulder's myriad second-hand bookshops. They would take Danny right up to second-grade reading level, a program she had told Jack she thought was much too ambitious. Their son was intelligent, they knew that, but it would be a mistake to push him too far too fast. Jack had agreed. There would be no pushing involved, but if the kid caught on fast, they would be prepared. And now she wondered if Jack hadn't been right about that, too. Danny, prepared by 4 years of Sesame Street and 3 years of the Electric Company, seemed to be catching on with almost scary speed. It bothered her. He hunched over the innocuous little books, his crystal radio and balsa glider on the shelf above him, as though his life depended on learning to read. His small face was more tense and paler than she liked in the close and cozy glow of the gooseneck lamp they had put in his room. He was taking it very seriously. Both the reading and the workbook pages that Father made up for him every afternoon. Picture of an apple and a peach. The word apple written beneath in Jack's large, neatly made printing. Circle the right picture, the one that went with the word. And their son would stare from word to pictures, his lips moving, sounding out, actually sweating it out, and with his double-sized red pencil curled into his pudgy right fist, he could now write about 3 dozen words of his own. His finger traced slowly under the words in the reader. Above them was a picture Wendy half remembered from her own grammar school days, 19 years before. A laughing boy with brown curly hair, a girl in a short dress, her hair in blonde ringlets, and one hand holding a jump rope, the prancing dog running after the large red rubber ball. The first grade Trinity. Dick, Jane, and Jip. See, Jip, run, Danny read slowly. Run, Jip, run. Run, run, run. He paused, dropping his finger down a line. See the... He bent closer, his nose almost touching the page now. See the... Not so close, Doc, Wendy said quietly. You'll hurt your eyes. It's... Don't tell me, he said, sitting up with a jerk. His voice was alarmed. Don't tell me, Mommy. I can get it. All right, honey, she said. But it's not a big thing. Really, it's not. Unheeding, Danny bent forward again. On his face was an expression that might be more commonly seen hovering over a graduate record exam in a college gym somewhere. She liked it less and less. See the... B-A-L-L. See the Bahal? See the Bahal. Ball! Suddenly triumphant. Fierce. The fierceness in his voice scared her. See the ball! That's right, she said. Honey, I think that's enough for tonight. A couple more pages, Mommy, please? No, Doc. She closed the red-bound book firmly. It's bedtime. Please? Don't tease me about it, Danny. Mommy's tired. Okay. But he looked longingly at the primer. Okay, Dad. It was a very Bobby Hill okay that I just came up with. Go kiss your father and then wash up. Don't forget to brush. Yeah. He slouched out, a small boy in pajama bottoms with feet and a large flannel top with a football in the front and New England Patriots written on the back. Jack's typewriter stopped. She heard Danny's hearty smack. Night, Danny. Good night, Doc. How'd you do? Okay, I guess. Mommy made me stop. Mommy was right. It's past 8:30. Going to the bathroom? Yeah. Good. There's potatoes growing out of your ears, and onions and carrots and chives, and Danny's giggle, fading, then cut off by the firm click of the bathroom door. He was private about his bathroom functions, while both she and Jack were pretty much catch as catch can. Another sign, they were multiplying all the time, that there was another human being in the place, not just a carbon copy of one of them or a combination of both. It made her a little sad. Someday her child would be a stranger to her. She would be strange to him, but not as strange as her own mother had become to her. Please don't let it be that way, God. Let him grow up and still love his mother. Jack's typewriter began its irregular bursts again. Still sitting in the chair beside Danny's reading table, she let her eyes wander around her son's room. The glider's wing had been neatly mended. His desk was piled high with picture books, coloring books, old Spider-Man comic books with the covers half torn off, Crayolas, and an untied pile of Lincoln logs. The VW model was neatly placed above all these lesser things, and its shrink wrap was still undisturbed. He and his father would be putting it together tomorrow night or the night after if Danny went on at this rate. And never mind the end of the week. His pictures of Pooh and Eeyore and Christopher Robin were tacked neatly to the wall, soon enough to be replaced with pin-ups and photographs of dope-smoking rock singers, she supposed. Innocence to experience. Human nature, baby. Grab it and growl. Still, it made her sad. Next year, he would be in school, and she would lose at least half of him, maybe more, to his friends. She and Jack had tried to have another one for a while when things had seemed to be going well at Stovington, but she was on the pill again now. Things were too uncertain. God knew where they would be in 9 months. Her eyes fell upon the wasp's nest. It held the ultimate high place in Danny's room, resting on a large plastic plate with the table by his bed. She didn't like it, even if it was empty. She wondered vaguely if it might have germs, thought to ask Jack, then decided he would laugh at her. But she could ask the doctor tomorrow, if she could catch him with Jack out of the room. She didn't like the idea of that thing, constructed from the chewings and saliva of so many alien creatures, lying within a foot of her sleeping son's head. The water in the bathroom was still running, and she got up and went to the big bedroom to make sure everything was okay. Jack didn't look up. He was lost in the world he was making, staring at the typewriter, a filter cigarette clamped in his teeth. She knocked lightly on the closed bathroom door. You okay, Doc? You awake? No answer. Danny? No answer. She tried the door. It was locked. Danny? Danny! She was worried now. The lack of any sound beneath the steadily running water made her uneasy. Danny! Open the door, honey. No answer. Danny! Jesus Christ, Wendy, I can't think if you're going to pound on the door all night. Danny's locked himself in the bathroom and he doesn't answer me. Jack came around the desk looking put out. He knocked on the door once, hard. Open up, Danny. No games. No answer. Jack knocked harder. Stop fooling, Doc. Bedtime's bedtime. Spanking if you don't get up. He's losing his temper, she thought, and was more afraid. He had not touched Danny in anger since that evening 2 years ago, but at this moment he sounded angry enough to do it. Danny, honey, she began. No answer, only running water. Danny, if you make me break this lock, I can guarantee you'll spend the night sleeping on your belly, Jack warned. Nothing. Break it, she said, and suddenly it was hard to talk. Quick. He raised one foot and brought it down hard against the door to the right of the knob. The lock was a poor thing. It gave immediately, and the door shuddered open, banging the tiled bathroom wall and rebounding halfway. Danny! She screamed. The water was running in full force in the basin. Beside it, a tube of Crest with the cap off. Danny was sitting on the rim of the bathtub across the room, his toothbrush clasped limply in his left hand, a thin foam of toothpaste around his mouth. He was staring, trance-like, into the mirror on the front of the medicine cabinet above the wash basin. The expression on his face was one of drugged horror, and her first thought was that he was having some sort of epileptic seizure, that he might have swallowed his tongue. Danny! Danny didn't answer. Guttural sounds came from his throat. Then she was pushed aside so hard that she crashed into the towel rack, and Jack was kneeling in front of the boy. Danny, he said. Danny, Danny! He snapped his fingers in front of Danny's blank eyes. Sure, Danny said. Tournament play. Stroke. Danny! Roke! Danny said, his voice suddenly deep, almost manlike. Roke. Stroke. The roke mallet has two sides. Gah. Oh, Jack, oh my God, what's wrong with him? Jack grabbed the boy's elbows and shook him hard. Danny's head rolled limply backward and then snapped forward like a balloon on a stick. Roke. Stroke. Red rum. Jack shook him again, and Danny's eyes suddenly cleared. His toothbrush fell out of his hand and onto the tiled floor with a small click. What? He asked, looking around. He saw his father kneeling before him, Wendy standing by the wall. What? Danny asked again, with rising alarm. What's... Don't stutter! Jack suddenly screamed into his face. Danny cried out in shock, his body going tense, trying to draw away from his father, and then he collapsed into tears. Stricken, Jack pulled him close. Oh, honey, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Doc. Please don't cry. I'm sorry. Everything's okay. The water ran ceaselessly in the basin, and Wendy felt that she had suddenly stepped into some grinding nightmare where time ran backward to the time when her drunken husband had broken her son's arm and then had mewled over him in almost the exact same words. Oh, honey, I'm sorry, Doc, please, I'm so sorry. She ran to them both, pried Danny out of Jack's arms somehow. She saw the look of angry reproach on his face, but filed away for later consideration, and lifted him up. She walked him back into the small bedroom, Danny's arms clasped around her neck, Jack trailing them. God, son of a bitch. My computer keeps threatening to fall asleep, and I feel like that's gonna mess with the recording. I need to fix the sleep timer or something. She walked him back into the small bedroom, Danny's arms clasped around her neck, Jack trailing them. She sat down on Danny's bed and rocked him back and forth, soothing him with nonsensical words repeated over and over. She looked up at Jack, and there was only worry in his eyes now. He raised questioning eyebrows at her. She shook her head faintly. Danny, she said. Danny. It's okay, Doc. It's fine. At last, Danny was quiet, only faintly trembling in her arms. Yet it was Jack he spoke to first. Jack, who was now sitting beside them on the bed, and she felt the old faint pang, it's him first, it's always been him first, of jealousy. Jack had shouted at him. She had comforted him. Yet it was to his father that Danny had said, I'm sorry if I was bad. Nothing to be sorry for, Doc. Jack ruffled his hair. What the hell happened in there? Danny shook his head slowly, dazedly. I don't know. Why did you tell me to stop stuttering, Daddy? I don't stutter. Of course not, Jack said heartily, but Wendy felt a cold finger touch her heart. Jack suddenly looked scared, as if he'd seen something that might have just been a ghost. Something about the timer, Danny muttered. What? What? Jack was leaning forward, and Danny flinched in her arms. Jack, you're scaring him, she said, and her voice was high, accusatory. Suddenly it came to her that they were all scared. But of what? I don't know. I don't know, Danny was saying to his father. What did I say, Daddy? Nothing, Jack muttered. He took his handkerchief from his back pocket and wiped his mouth with it. Wendy had a moment of that sickening time is running backward feeling again. It was a gesture she remembered well from his drinking days. "Why did you lock the door, Danny?" she asked gently. "Why did you do that?" "Tony," he said. "Tony told me to." They exchanged a glance over the top of his head. "Did Tony say why, son?" Jack asked quietly. "I was brushing my teeth and I was thinking about my reading," Danny said. "Thinking real hard. And I saw Tony way down in the mirror. He said he had to show me again." "You mean he was behind you?" Wendy asked. "No, he was in the mirror." Danny was very emphatic on this point. "Way down deep. And then I went through the mirror. Next thing I remember, Daddy was shaking me and I thought I was being bad again." Jack winced as if struck. "No, Doc," he said quietly. "Tony told you to lock the door?" Wendy asked, brushing his hair. "Yes." "And what did he want to show you?" Danny tensed in her arms. It was as if the muscles in his body had turned into something like piano wire. "I don't remember," he said, distraught. "I don't remember. Don't ask me. I don't remember nothing." "Shh," Wendy said, alarmed. She began to rock him again. "It's all right if you don't remember, hon." "Sure it is." At last Danny began to relax again. "Do you want me to stay a little while? Read you a story?" "No, just the nightlight." He looked shyly at his father. "Would you stay, Daddy? For a minute?" "Sure, Doc." Wendy sighed. "I'll be in the living room, Jack." "Okay." She got up and watched as Danny slid under the covers. He seemed very small. "Are you sure you're okay, Danny?" "I'm okay. Just plug in Snoopy, Mom." "Sure." She plugged in the nightlight, which showed Snoopy lying fast asleep on top of his doghouse. He had never wanted a nightlight until they moved into the overlook, and then he had specifically requested one. She turned off the lamp in the overhead, and Danny looked back to them, the small white circle of Danny's face, and Jack's above it. She hesitated a moment, and then I went through the mirror and left them quietly. "You sleepy?" Jack asked, brushing Danny's hair off his forehead. "Yeah." "Want a drink of water?" "No." There was silence for 5 minutes. Danny was still beneath his hand. Thinking the boy had dropped off, he was about to get up and leave quietly, when Danny said from the brink of sleep, "Roke." Jack turned back, all zero to the bone. "Danny?" "You'd never hurt Mommy, would you, Daddy?" "No." "Or me?" "No." Silence again, spinning out. "Daddy?" "What?" "Tony came and told me about Roke." "Did he, Doc? What did he say?" "I don't remember much, except he said it was played in innings, like baseball. Isn't that funny?" "Yeah." Jack's heart was thudding dully in his chest. How could the boy possibly know a thing like that? Roke was played by innings, not like baseball, but like cricket. "Daddy?" He was almost asleep now. "What?" "What's red rum?" "Red drum?" Sounds like something an Indian might take on the warpath. Silence. "Hey, Doc?" But Danny was asleep, breathing in long, slow strokes. Jack sat looking down at him for a moment, and a rush of love pushed through him like tidal water. Why had he yelled at the boy like that? It was perfectly normal for him to stutter a little. He had been coming out of a daze or some weird kind of trance, and stuttering was perfectly normal under those circumstances. Perfectly. He hadn't said the timer at all. It had been something else. Nonsense. Gibberish. How had he known Roke was played in innings? Had someone told him? Ullman? Halloran? He looked down at his hands. They were made in a tight, clenched fist of tension. "God, how I need a drink!" And the nails were digging into his palms like tiny brands. Slowly, he forced them to open. "I love you, Danny," he whispered. "God knows I do." He left the room. He had lost his temper again. Only a little, but enough to make him feel sick and afraid. A drink would blunt that feeling. Oh, yes, it would blunt that something about the timer and everything else. There was no mistake about those words at all. None. Each had come out clear as a bell. He paused in the hallway, looking back, and automatically wiped his lips with a handkerchief. Their shapes were only dark silhouettes in the glow of the night light. Wendy, wearing only panties, went to his bed and tucked him in again. He had kicked the covers back. Jack stood in the doorway, watching as she put her inner wrist against his forehead. "Is he feverish?" "No." She kissed his cheek. "Thank God you made that appointment," he said as she came back into the doorway. "You think that guy knows his stuff?" "The checker said he was very good. That's all I know." If there's something wrong, I'm gonna send him and you to your mother's, Wendy. No. I know, he said, putting an arm around her, how you feel. You don't know how I feel at all about her. Wendy, there's no place else I can send you. You know that. If you came without this job, we're done, he said simply. You know that. Her silhouette nodded slowly. She knew it. When I had that interview with Ullman, I thought he was just blowing off his bazoo. Now I'm not so sure. Maybe I really shouldn't have tried this with you two along, 40 miles from nowhere. I love you, she said, and Danny loves you even more if that's possible. He would have been heartbroken, Jack. He will be if you send us away. Don't make it sound that way. If the doctor says there's something wrong, I'll look for a job in Sidewinder, she said. If I can't get one in Sidewinder, Danny and I will go back to Boulder. I can't go to my mother, Jack, not on these terms. Don't ask me. I just can't. I guess I know that. Cheer up. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe. The appointment's at 2? Yes. Let's leave the bedroom door open, Wendy. I want to, but I don't think he'll sleep through now. But I think he'll sleep through now. But he didn't. Boom. 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 He fled the heavy, crashing, echoing sounds through twisting, maze-like corridors, his bare feet whispering over a deep pile jungle of blue and back. Each time he heard the roque mallet smash into the wall somewhere behind him, he wanted to scream aloud. But he mustn't. A scream would give him away, and then Red Rum, come out here and take your medicine, you fucking crybaby. Oh, and then he could hear the owner of that voice coming for him, charging up the hall like a tiger in an alien blue-black jungle. A man-eater. Come out here, you little son of a bitch! If he could get to the stairs going down, if he could get off this third floor, he might be alright. Even the elevator, if he could remember what had been forgotten. But it was dark, and in his terror he had lost his orientation. He turned down one corridor and then another, his heart leaping into his mouth like a hot lump of ice, fearing that each turn would bring him face to face with the human tiger in these halls. The booming was right behind him now, the awful, hoarse shouting, the whistle of the air, the whistle of the head of the mallet cutting through the air. Roque, stroke, Red Rum, before it crashed into the wall. The soft whisper of feet on the jungle carpet, panic squirting in his mouth like bitter juice. He will remember what was forgotten. But would he? What was it? He fled around another corner and saw with a creeping, utter horror that he was in a cul-de-sac. Locked doors frowned at him from three sides. The west wing. He was in the west wing, and outside he could hear the storm whooping and screaming, seeming to choke on its own dark throat filled with snow. He backed up against the wall, weeping with terror now, his heart racing like the heart of a rabbit caught in a snare. When his back was against the light blue silk wallpaper with the embossed pattern of wavy lines, his legs gave away and he collapsed to the carpet, hands splayed on the jungle of woven vines and creepers, the breath whistling in and out of his throat. Louder. Louder. There was a tiger in the hall. Another tiger was just around the corner, still crying out in that shrill and petulant and lunatic rage, the roque mallet slamming, because this tiger walked on two legs, and it was... He woke with a sudden indrawn gasp, staring bolt upright in bed, eyes wide and staring into the darkness, hands crossed in front of his face. Something was on one hand, crawling. Wasps, 3 of them. They stung him then, seeming to needle all at once, and it was then when the images broke apart and fell on him in a dark flood, and he began to shriek into the dark, the wasps clinging to his left hand, stinging him again and again. The lights went on, and Danny was standing there in his shorts, his eyes glaring, Mommy behind him, sleepy and scared. "Get them off me!" Danny screamed. "Oh my God," Jack said. He saw. "Jack, what's wrong with him? What's wrong?" He didn't answer her. He ran to the bed, scooped up Danny's pillow, and slapped Danny's thrashing left hand with it. Again. Wendy saw lumbering, insectile forms rise into the air, droning. "Get a magazine!" he yelled over his shoulder. "Kill them!" "Wasps," she said, and for a moment she was inside herself, almost detached in her realization. Then her mind cross-patched, and knowledge was connected to emotion. "Wasps! Oh God, Jesus, Jack, you said, shut the fuck up and killed him!" he roared. "Will you do what I say?" Ooh, nice voice crack. She took a coloring book off his work table and slammed it down on the wasp. It left a viscous brown smear. "There's another one on the curtain," he said, and he ran past her with Danny in his arms. He took the boy into their bedroom and put him on Wendy's side of the makeshift double. "Lay right there, Danny. Don't come back till I tell you to. Understand?" His face puffed and streaked with tears. Danny nodded. "That's my brave boy." Jack ran back around the hall to the stairs. Behind him he had heard the coloring book slap twice, and then his wife screamed in pain. He didn't slow, but went down the stairs 2 by 2 into the darkened lobby. He went through Ullman's office into the kitchen, slamming the heavy part of his thigh into the corner of Ullman's oak desk, barely feeling it. He slapped on the kitchen overhead and crossed to the sink. The wash dishes from supper were still heaped up by the drainer, where Wendy had left them to drip dry. He snatched the big Pyrex bowl off the top. A dish fell to the floor and exploded. Ignoring it, he turned and ran back to the office and up the stairs. Wendy was standing outside Danny's door, breathing hard. Her face was the color of table linen. Her eyes were shiny and flat. Her hair hung damply against her neck. I got all of them, she said dully, but one stung me. Jack, you said they were all dead. She began to cry. He slipped past her without answering and carried the Pyrex bowl over to the nest by Danny's bed. It was still. Nothing there. On the outside, anyway. He slammed the bowl down over the nest. God damn it, it fell asleep again. I'm really stupid for letting that happen over and over. There, he said. Come on. They went back into their bedroom. Where did it get you? He asked her. On my wrist. Let's see. She showed it to him. Just above the bracelet of lines between wrist and palm, there was a small circular hole. The flesh around it was puffing up. Are you allergic to stings? He asked. Think hard. If you are, Danny might be. That fucking little bastard's got him 5 or 6 times. No, she said more calmly. I just hate them. That's all. Hate them. Danny was sitting on the foot of the bed, holding his left hand and looking at them. His eyes, circled with the white of shock, looked at Jack reproachfully. Daddy, you said they killed them all. My hand, it really hurts. Let's see it, Doc. No, I'm not going to touch it. That would make it hurt even more. Just hold it out. He did, and Wendy moaned. Oh, Danny, oh, your poor hand. Later, the doctor would count 11 separate stings. Now all they saw was the dotting of small holes, as if his palm and fingers had been sprinkled with grains of red pepper. The swelling was bad. His hand had begun to look like one of those cartoon images where Bugs Bunny or Daffy Duck had just slain himself with a hammer. Wendy, go get that spray stuff in the bathroom, he said. She went after it, and he sat down next to Danny and slipped an arm around his shoulders. After we spray your hand, I want to take some Polaroids of it, Doc. Then you sleep the rest of the night with us, okay? Sure, Danny said. But why are we going to take pictures? So maybe we can sue the ass out of some people. Wendy came back with a spray tube in the shape of a chemical fire extinguisher. This won't hurt, honey, she said, taking off the cap. Danny held out his hand, and she sprayed both sides until it gleamed. He let out a long, shuddery sigh. Does it smart? She asked. No, feels better. Now these, crunch them up. She held out 5 orange-flavored baby aspirin. Danny took them and popped them into his mouth one by one. Isn't that a lot of aspirin? Jack asked. It's a lot of stings, she snapped at him angrily. You go and get rid of that nest, John Torrance, right now. Just a minute. He went over to the dresser and took his Polaroid square shooter out of the top drawer. He rummaged deeper and found some flash cubes. Jack, what are you doing? She asked a little hysterically. He's going to take some pictures of my hand, Danny said gravely. And then we're going to sue the ass out of some people, right, Dad? Right, Jack said grimly. He had found the flash attachment and jabbed it onto the camera. Hold it out, son. I figure about $5,000 a sting. What are you talking about? Wendy nearly screamed. I'll tell you what, he said. I followed the directions on that fucking bub bomb. We're going to sue them. That damn thing was defective. Had to have been. How else can you explain this? Oh, she said in a small voice. He took 4 pictures, pulling out each covered print for Wendy to time on the small locket watch she wore around her neck. Danny, fascinated with the idea that his stung hand might be worth thousands and thousands of dollars, began to lose some of his fright and take an active interest. The hand throbbed dully, and he had a small headache. When Jack put the camera away and spread the prints out on top of the dresser to dry, Wendy said, Should we take him to the doctor tonight? Not unless he's really in pain, Jack said. If a person has a strong allergy to wasp venom, it hits within 30 seconds. Hits? What do you... A coma, or convulsions. Oh, my Jesus. She cupped her hands over her elbows and hugged herself, looking pale and wan. How do you feel, son? Think you could sleep? Danny blinked at them. The nightmare had faded to a dull, featureless background in his mind, but he was still frightened. If I can sleep with you. Of course, Wendy said. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. It's okay, Mommy. She began to cry again. Jack put his hands on her shoulders. Wendy, I swear to you that I followed those directions. Will you get rid of it in the morning, please? Of course I will. The 3 of them got in bed together. Jack was about to snap off the light over the bed when he paused and pushed the covers back instead. Want a picture of the nest, too. Come right back. I will. He went to the dresser and got the camera and the last flash cube and gave Danny a closed thumb and forefinger circle. Danny smiled and gave it back with his good hand. Quite a kid, he thought as he walked down to Danny's room. All that and then some. The overhead was still on. Jack crossed the bunk setup, and as he glanced at the table beside it, his skin crawled into goose flesh. The short hairs on his neck pricked and tried to stand erect. He could hardly see the nest through the Pyrex bowl. The inside of the glass was crawling with wasps. It was hard to tell how many. 50 at least, maybe 100. His heart thudding slowly in his chest, he took his pictures, and then set the camera down to wait for them to develop. He wiped his lips with the palm of his hand. One thought played over and over in his mind, echoing with, "You lost your temper, you lost your temper, you lost your temper," and almost superstitious dread. They had come back. He had killed the wasps, but they had come back. In his mind, he heard himself screaming into his frightened, crying son's face. "Don't stutter!" He wiped his lips again. He went to Danny's work table, rummaged in his drawers, and came up with a big jigsaw puzzle with a fiberboard backing. He took it over to the bed table and carefully slid the ball and the nest onto it. The wasps buzzed angrily inside their prison. Then, putting his hand firmly on top of the ball so it wouldn't slip, he went out into the hall. "Coming to bed, Jack?" Wendy asked. "Coming to bed, Daddy?" "I have to go downstairs for a minute," he said, making his voice light. How had it happened? How in God's name? The bomb sure hadn't been a dud. He had seen the thick white smoke start to puff out of it when he had pulled the ring. And when he had gone up 2 hours later, he had shaken the drift of small dead bodies out of the hole in the top. Then how? Spontaneous regeneration? That was crazy 17th century bullshit. Insects don't regenerate. And even if wasps' eggs could mature into full-grown insects in 12 hours, this wasn't the season in which the queen laid. That happened in April or May. Fall was their dying time. A living contradiction. The wasps buzzed furiously under the bowl. He took them downstairs and through the kitchen. In back there was a door which gave on the outside. A cold night wind blew against his nearly naked body, and his feet went numb almost instantly against the cold concrete of the platform he was standing on. Platform where milk deliveries were made during the hotel's operating season. He put the puzzle and the bowl down carefully, and when he stood up, he looked at the thermometer nailed outside the door. "Fresh up with 7-Up," the thermometer said, and the mercury stood at an even 25 degrees. The cold would kill them by morning. He went in and shut the door firmly. After a moment's thought, he locked it, too. He crossed the kitchen again and shut off the lights. He stood in the darkness for a moment, thinking, wanting a drink. Suddenly the hotel seemed full of 1,000 stealthy sounds, creakings and groans, and the sly sniff of the wind under the eaves, where more wasps' nests might be hanging, like a deadly fruit. They had come back. And suddenly he found out that he didn't like the Overlook so well anymore. As if it wasn't wasps that had stung his son. Wasps that had miraculously lived through the bug bomb's assault. But the hotel itself. His last thought before going upstairs to his wife and son, "From now on you will hold your temper, no matter what," was firm and hard and sure. As he went down to the hall to them, he wiped his lips with the back of his hand. That's the end of chapter 16. Phew. That's a fucking doozy, isn't it? He killed the wasps, but they came back, seemingly supernaturally. And I think the metaphor there is obvious and fun and poignant, and not really fun, but very compelling in my opinion. It's one of my favorite things I think about this section of the book is the he had killed the wasps but they came back sort of metaphor that happens. The embodiment of Jack's fear and self-loathing. I'm getting better. I killed the wasps, but he sees them come back. And it's this terrifying, almost hopeless feeling. Like, it's obvious that the wasps represent Jack's demons. And he's coming to the Overlook, and he's like, "No, I killed them, or I'm in the process of killing them. I'm getting better. I'm closing the door. I killed the wasps. Everything's gonna be okay. I killed the wasps. There is no possible way for them to come back." But they came back, and and it just, you can feel his heart drop into his stomach. They had come back. Super fun. Big fan of it. I'm gonna take a quick break. I'm gonna use the bathroom, get a drink, all that. All right. So that was a pretty intense chapter. Jack's wiping his lips compulsively. Wendy says that's a gesture that was common in his drinking days for whatever reason. Chapter 17. The doctor's office. Stripped to his underpants, lying on the examination table, Danny Torrance had looked very small. He was looking up at Dr. Just Call Me Bill Edwards, who was wheeling a large black machine up beside him. Danny rolled his eyes to get a better look at it. Don't let it scare you, guy, Bill Edmonds said. It's an electroencephalograph, and it doesn't hurt. We call it EEG for short. I'm going to hook up a bunch of wires to your head. No, not stick them in, only tape them. And the pens of this part of the gadget will record your brain waves. Like on the $6 Million Man? About the same. Would you like to be like Steve Austin when you grow up? No way, Danny said as the nurse began to tape the wires to a number of tiny shaved spots on his scalp. My daddy says that someday he'll get a short circuit and then he'll be up the creek. I know that creek well, Dr. Edmonds said amiably. I've been up it a few times myself, sans paddle. An EEG can tell us lots of things, Danny. Like what? Like, for instance, if you have epilepsy. That's a little problem where... Yeah, I know what epilepsy is. Really? Sure. There was a kid in my nursery school back in Vermont. I went to nursery school when I was a little kid, and he had it. He wasn't supposed to use the flashboard. What was that, Dan? He turned on the machine. Thin lines began to trace their way across graph paper. It had all these lights, all different colors, and when you turned it on, some colors would flash, but not all. And you had to count the colors, and if you pushed the right button, you could turn it off. Brent couldn't use that. That's because bright flashing lights sometimes cause an epileptic seizure. You mean using the flashboard might have made Brent pitch a fit? Edmonds and the nurse exchanged a brief, amused glance. Inelegantly but accurately put, Danny. What? I said you're right, except you should say seizure instead of pitch a fit. That's not nice. Okay, lie just as still as a mouse now. Who's messaging me? Okay, Dad. Danny, when you have these, whatever they are, do you recall seeing bright flashing lights before? No. Funny noises? Ringing or chimes like a doorbell? How about a funny smell, like maybe oranges or sawdust, or a smell like something rotten? No, sir. Sometimes do you feel like crying before you pass out, even though you don't feel sad? No way. That's fine then. Have I got epilepsy, Dr. Bill? I don't think so, Danny. Just lie still. Almost done. The machine hummed and scratched for another 5 minutes, and then Dr. Edmonds shut it off. All done, guy, Edmonds said briskly. Let Sally get those electrodes off you, and then come into the next room. I want to have a little talk with you, okay? Sure. Sally, you go ahead and give him a time test before he comes in. All right. Edmonds ripped off the long curl of paper the machine had extruded and went to the next room, looking at it. I'm going to prick your arm just a little, the nurse said after Danny had pulled up his pants. It's to make sure you don't have TB. They gave me that when I was in school just last year, Danny said without much hope. That was a long time ago, and you're a big boy now, right? I guess so. Danny sighed and offered his arm up for sacrifice. When he had his shirt and shoes on, he went through the sliding door and into Dr. Edmonds' office. Edmonds was sitting on the edge of his desk, swinging his legs thoughtfully. Hi, Danny. Hi. How's that hand now? He pointed at Danny's left hand, which was lightly bandaged. Pretty good. Good. I looked at your EEG and it seems fine, but I'm going to send it to a friend of mine in Denver who makes his living reading these things. You know, I just want to make sure. Yes, sir. Tell me about Tony, Dan. Danny shuffled his feet. He's just an invisible friend, he says. I made him up to keep me company. Edmonds laughed and put his hands on Danny's shoulders. That's what your mom and dad say. But this is just between us, Guy. I'm your doctor. Tell me the truth, and I'll promise not to tell them unless you say I can. Danny thought about it. He looked at Edmonds, and then, with a small effort of concentration, he tried to catch Edmonds' thoughts, or at least the color of his mood. Suddenly, he got an oddly comforting image in his head. File cabinets, their doors sliding shut, one after another, locking with a click. Written on the small tabs in the center of each door was A to C, secret, D to G, secret, and so on. This made Danny feel a little easier. Cautiously, he said, I don't know who Tony is. Is he your age? No, he's at least 11. I think he might be even older. I've never seen him up close. He might be old enough to drive a car. You just see him at a distance, huh? Yes, sir. And he always comes just before you pass out? Well, I don't pass out. It's like I go with him, and he shows me things. What kind of things? Well, Danny debated for a moment, and then told Edmonds about Daddy's trunk, with all his writing in it, and about how the movers hadn't lost it between Vermont and Colorado after all. It had been right under the stairs all along. And your daddy found it where Tony said he would? Oh, yes, sir. Only Tony didn't tell me, he showed me. I understand, Danny. Check this thing real quick. I understand, Danny. What did Tony show you last night, when you locked yourself in the bathroom? I don't remember, Danny said quickly. Are you sure? Yes, sir. A moment ago I said you locked the bathroom door, but that wasn't right, was it? Tony locked the door. No, sir. Tony couldn't lock the door because he's not real. He wanted me to do it, so I did. I locked it. Does Tony always show you where lost things are? No, sir. Sometimes he shows me things that are gonna happen. Really? Sure. Like one time, Tony showed me the amusements in Wild Animal Park in Great Barrington. Tony said Daddy was going to take me there for my birthday. He did, too. What else does he show you? Danny frowned. Signs. He's always showing me stupid old signs. I can't read them hardly ever. Why do you suppose Tony would do that, Danny? I don't know. Danny brightened. But my daddy and mommy are teaching me to read, and I'm trying real hard. So you can read Tony's signs. Well, I really like to learn. But that too, yeah. Do you like Tony, Danny? Danny looked at the tile floor and said nothing. Danny? It's hard to tell, Danny said. I used to. I used to hope he'd come every day, because he always showed me good things, especially since Mommy and Daddy didn't think about divorce anymore. Dr. Edmonds' gaze sharpened, but Danny didn't notice. He was looking hard at the floor, concentrating on expressing himself. But now whenever he comes, he shows me bad things, awful things, like in the bathroom last night. The things he shows me, they sting me like those wasps stung me, only Tony's things sting me up here. He cocked a finger gravely to his temple, a small boy unconsciously burlesquing suicide. What things, Danny? I can't remember, Danny cried out, agonized. I'd tell you if I could. It's like I can't remember because it's so bad I don't want to remember. All I can remember when I wake up is red rum. Red drum or red rum? Rum. What's that, Danny? I don't know. Danny? Yes, sir? Can you make Tony come now? I don't know. He doesn't always come. I don't even know if I want him to come anymore. Try, Danny. I'll be right here. Danny looked at Edmonds doubtfully. Edmonds nodded encouragement. Danny let out a long, sighing breath and nodded. But I don't know if it'll work. I never did it with anyone looking at me before. Tony doesn't always come, anyway. If he doesn't come, he doesn't come, Edmonds said. I just want you to try. Okay. He dropped his gaze to Edmonds' slowly swinging loafers and cast his mind outward toward his mommy and daddy. They were here someplace, right beyond that wall with the picture on it, as a matter of fact, in the waiting room where they'd come in, sitting side by side but not talking, leafing through magazines, worried, about him. He concentrated harder, his brow furrowing, trying to get into the feeling of his mommy's thoughts. It was always harder when they weren't right there in the room with him. Then he began to get it. Mommy was thinking about a sister. Her sister. The sister was dead. His mommy was thinking into the main thing. His mommy was thinking that the main thing that had turned her mommy into such a hitch? Into such an old biddy. Because her sister had died. As a little girl, she was hit by a car. Oh God, I could never stand anything like that again, like Eileen. But what if he's sick, really sick? Cancer, spinal meningitis, leukemia, brain tumor, like John Gunther's son, or muscular dystrophy. Oh geez, kids his age get leukemia all the time. Radium treatments, chemotherapy. We couldn't afford anything like that. But of course, they can't just turn you out to die on the street, can they? And anyway, he's all right. He's all right. All right. All right. You really shouldn't let yourself think, Danny, about Eileen and Danny. That car. Danny. But Tony wasn't there. Only his voice. And as it faded, come on, page, followed it, and as it faded, Danny followed it down into the darkness, falling and tumbling into some magic hole between Dr. Bill's swinging loafers, past a loud knocking sound. Further, a bathtub cruised silently by in the darkness with some horrible thing lolling in it, past a sound like sweetly chiming church bells, past a clock under a dome of glass. Then the dark was pierced feebly by a single light, festooned with cobwebs. The weak glow disclosed a stone floor that looked damp and unpleasant. Somewhere not far distant was a steady mechanical roaring sound, but muted, not frightening. Soporific. It was the thing that would be forgotten, Danny thought with dreamy surprise. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he could see Tony just ahead of him, a silhouette. Tony was looking at something, and Danny strained his eyes to see what it was. Your daddy. See your daddy? Of course he did. How could he have missed him even in the basement light's feeble glow? Daddy was kneeling on the floor, casting the beam of a flashlight over old cardboard boxes and wooden crates. The cardboard boxes were mushy and old. Some of them had split open and spilled drifts of paper onto the floor. Newspapers, books, printed pieces of paper that looked like bills. His daddy was examining them with great interest. And then Daddy looked up and shone his flashlight in another direction. Its beam of light impaled another book, a large white one bound with gold string. The cover looked like white leather. It was a scrapbook. Danny suddenly needed to cry out to his daddy, to tell him to leave that book alone, that some books should not be opened, but his daddy was climbing towards it. The mechanical roaring sound, which he now recognized as the boiler at the Overlook, which Daddy checked 3 or 4 times every day, had developed an ominous, rhythmic hitching. It began to sound like pounding, and the smell of mildew and wet, rotting paper was changing into something else, the high, junipery smell of the bad stuff. It hung around his daddy like a vapor as he reached for the book and grasped it. Tony was somewhere in the darkness. This inhuman place makes human monsters. This inhuman place, repeating the same incomprehensible thing over and over, makes human monsters. Falling through darkness again, now accompanied by the heavy pounding thunder that was no longer the boiler, but the sound of whistling mallets striking silk-papered walls, knocking out whiffs of plaster dust, crouching helplessly on the blue-black woven rug. Come out! This inhuman place! Take your medicine! Makes human monsters! With a gasp that echoed in his own head as he jerked himself out of the darkness. Hands were on him, and at first he shrank back, thinking about that dark thing in the Overlook of Tony's world that had somehow followed him back into the real world of real things. And then Dr. Edmonds was saying, "You're all right, Danny. You're all right. Everything's fine." Danny recognized the doctor, then his surroundings in the office. He began to shudder helplessly. Edmonds held him. When the reaction began to subside, Edmonds asked, "You said something about monsters, Danny. What was it?" "This inhuman place," he said gutturally. "Tony told me this inhuman place makes... He shook his head. "Can't remember." "Try." "I can't." "Did Tony come?" "Yes." "What did he show you?" Dark, pounding. I don't remember." "Where were you?" "Leave me alone. I don't remember. Leave me alone." He began to sob helplessly in fear and frustration. It was all gone, dissolved into a sticky mess like a wet bundle of paper. The memory was unreadable. Edmonds went to a water cooler and got him a paper cup of water. Danny drank it, and Edmonds got him another one. "Better?" "Yes." "Danny, I don't want to badger you. Tease you about this, I mean. But can you remember anything about before Tony came?" "My mommy," Danny said slowly. "She's worried about me." "Mothers always are, Guy." "No. She had a sister that died when she was a little girl. Eileen. She was thinking about how Eileen got hit by a car, and it made her worried about me. I don't remember anything else." Edmonds was looking at him sharply. "Just now she was thinking that? Out in the waiting room?" "Yes, sir." "Danny, how would you know that?" "I don't know," Danny said wanly. "The Shining, I guess." "The what?" Danny shook his head very slowly. "I'm awful tired. Can I go see my mommy and daddy? I don't want to answer any more questions. I'm tired and my stomach hurts." "Are you going to throw up?" "No, sir. I just want to go see my mommy and daddy." "Okay, Dan." Edmonds stood up. "You go on out and see them for a minute, then send them in so I can talk to them, okay?" "Yes, sir." "There are books out there to look at. You like books, don't you?" "Yes, sir," Danny said dutifully. "You're a good boy, Danny." Danny gave him a faint smile. "I can't find a thing wrong with him," Dr. Edmonds said to the Torrances. "Not physically. Mentally, he's bright and rather too imaginative. It happens. Children have to grow into their imaginations like a pair of oversized shoes. Danny's is still way too big for him. Ever had his IQ tested?" "I don't believe in them," Jack said. "They straitjacket the expectations of both parents and teachers." Dr. Edmonds nodded. "That may be. But if you did test him, I think you'd find he's right off the scale for his age group. His verbal ability for a boy who is 5 going on 6 is amazing." "We don't talk down to him," Jack said with a trace of pride. "I doubt if you've ever had to." Edmonds paused, fiddling with a pen. He went into a trance while I was with him, at my request, exactly as you described, with him in the bathroom last night. All his muscles went lax, his body slumped, his eyeballs rotated outward. Textbook auto-hypnosis. I was amazed. I still am. The Torrances sat forward. What happened? Wendy asked tensely. At Edmund's carefully related Danny's trance, the muttered phrase from which Edmonds had only been able to pluck the word monsters, the dark, the pounding. The aftermath of tears, near hysteria, the nervous stomach. Tony again, Jack said. What does it mean? Wendy asked. Have you any idea? A few. You might not like them. Go ahead anyway, Jack told him. From what Danny told me, his invisible friend was truly a friend until you folks moved out here from New England. Tony's only become a threatening figure since that move. The pleasant interludes have become nightmarish, even more frightening to your son because he can't remember exactly what the nightmares are about. That's common enough. We all remember our pleasant dreams more clearly than the scary ones. There seems to be a buffer somewhere between the conscious and the subconscious, and one hell of a blue nose lives in there. The sensor only lets through a small amount. Often what does come through is only symbolic. That's oversimplified Freud, but it does pretty much describe what we know of the mind's interaction with itself. You think moving has upset Danny that badly? Wendy asked. It may have if the move took place under traumatic circumstances, Edmund said. Did it? Wendy and Jack exchanged a glance. I was teaching at prep school, Jack said slowly. I lost my job. I see, Edmund said, and then put the pen he had been playing with firmly back in its holder. There's more here, I'm afraid. It may be painful to you. Your son seems to believe you two have seriously contemplated divorce. He spoke of it in an offhand way, but only because he believes you are no longer considering it. Jack's mouth dropped open, and Wendy recoiled as if slapped. The blood drained from her face. We never even discussed it, she said. Not in front of him, not even in front of each other. I think it's best if you understand everything, Doctor, Jack said. Shortly after Dan was born, I became an alcoholic. I had had a drinking problem all the way through college. It subsided a little after Wendy and I met. Cropped up worse than ever after Danny was born, and the writing I considered to be my real work was going badly. When Danny was 3.5, he spilled some beer on a bunch of papers I was working on. Papers I was shuffling around anyway. And oh shit. His voice broke, but his eyes remained dry and unflinching. It sounds so goddamn beastly, he said out loud. I broke his arm, turning him around to spank him. 3 months later, I gave up drinking. I haven't touched it since. I see, Edmund said neutrally. I knew the arm had been broken, of course. It was set well. He pushed back from his desk a little and crossed his legs. If I may be frank, it's obvious that he's been in no way abused since then. Other than the stings, there's nothing on him but the normal bruises and scabs that any kid has in abundance. Of course not, Wendy said hotly. Jack didn't mean... No, Wendy, Jack said. I meant to do it. I guess someplace inside I really did mean to do it to him. Or something even worse. He looked back at Edmonds again. You know something, Doctor? This is the first time the word divorce has been mentioned between us. And alcoholism. And child beating. 3 firsts in 5 minutes. That may be the root of the problem, Edmund said. I'm not a psychiatrist. I can recommend a good one who works out of the Milson Ridge Medical Center in Boulder, but I'm fairly confident in my diagnosis. Danny is an intelligent, imaginative, perceptive boy. I don't believe he would have been as upset by your marital problems as you believed. Small children are great acceptors. They don't understand shame, or the need to hide things. Jack was studying his hands. Wendy took one of them and squeezed it. But he sensed that things were wrong. Chief among them, from his point of view, was not the broken arm, but the broken or breaking link between you two. He mentioned divorce to me, but not the broken arm. When my nurse mentioned the set to him, he simply shrugged it off. It was a no-pressure thing. It happened a long time ago, I think is what he said. That kid, Jack muttered. His jaws were clamped together, the muscles in the cheeks standing out. We don't deserve him. You have him all the same, Edmund said dryly. At any rate, he retires into a fantasy world from time to time. Nothing unusual about that. Lots of kids do. As I recall, I had my own invisible friend when I was Danny's age, a talking rooster named Chug Chug. Of course, no one could see Chug Chug but me. I had 2 older brothers who often left me behind, and in such a situation, Chug Chug came in mighty handy. And of course, you two must understand why Danny's invisible friend is named Tony instead of Mike or Hal or Dutch. Yes, Wendy said. Have you ever pointed out to him? No, Jack said. Should we? Why bother? Let him realize it in his own time by his own logic. You see, Danny's fantasies were considerably deeper than those that grow around the ordinary invisible friend syndrome. But he felt he needed Tony that much more. Tony would come and show him pleasant things, sometimes amazing things, always good things. Once Tony showed him where Daddy's lost trunk was, under the stairs. Another time, Tony showed him that Mommy and Daddy were going to take him to an amusement park for his birthday. Oh, at Great Barrington, Wendy cried. But how could he know those things? It's eerie, the things he comes out with sometimes, almost as if he has a second sight, Edmonds asked, smiling. He was born with a caul, Wendy said weakly. Edmund's smile became a good, hearty laugh. Jack and Wendy exchanged a glance, and then smiled, both of them amazed at how easy it was. Danny's occasional lucky guesses about things was something else they had not discussed much. Next, you'll be telling me you can levitate, Edmund said, still smiling. No, I'm afraid not. It's not extrasensory, but good old human perception, which in Danny's case is unusually keen. Mr. Torrance, he knew your trunk was under the stairs because you had looked everywhere else. Process of elimination, what? It's so simple, Ellery Queen would laugh at it. Sooner or later you would have thought of it yourself. As for the amusement park at Great Barrington, whose idea was that originally? Yours or his? His, of course, Wendy said. They advertised it on all the morning children's programs. He was wild to go. But the thing is, Doctor, we couldn't afford to take him, and we had told him so. Then a men's magazine I'd sold a story to back in 1971 sent a check for $50, Jack said. They were reprinting the story in an annual or something, so we decided to spend it on Danny. Edmund shrugged. Wish fulfillment plus a lucky coincidence. God damn it, I bet that's just right, Jack said. Edmund smiled a little. And Danny himself told me that Tony often showed him things that never occurred. Visions based on faulty perception, that's all. Danny is doing subconsciously what those so-called mystics and mind readers do quite consciously and cynically. I admire him for it. If life doesn't cause him to retract his antenna, I think he'll be quite a man. Wendy nodded. Of course, she thought, Danny would be quite a man. But the doctor's explanation struck her as glib. It tasted more like margarine than butter. Edmonds had not lived with them. He had not been there when Danny found lost buttons. Told her that maybe the TV guide was under the bed. That he thought he'd better wear his rubbers to nursery school even though the sun was out, and later that day had walked home under her umbrella through the pouring rain. Edmonds couldn't know of the curious way Danny had of pre-guessing them both. She would decide to have an unusual evening cup of tea, go out in the kitchen and find her cup out with a tea bag in it. She would remember that the books were due in the library and find them all neatly piled up on the hall table, her library card on top. Or Jack would take it into his head to wax the Volkswagen and find Danny already out there, listening to tinny top 40 music on his crystal radio as he sat on the curb to watch. Aloud she said, Then why the nightmares now? Why did Tony tell him to lock the bathroom door? I believe it's because Tony has outlived his usefulness, Edmund said. He was born, Tony, not Danny, at a time when you and your husband were straining to keep your marriage together. Your husband was drinking too much. There was an incident with a broken arm. The ominous quiet between you. Ominous quiet, yes, that phrase was the real thing anyway. The stiff, tense meals were the only conversation had been, please pass the butter, or Danny, eat the rest of your carrots, or may I be excused, please. The nights when Jack had gone and she had lain down, dry-eyed, on the couch while Danny watched TV. The mornings when she and Jack had stalked around each other like two angry cats with a quivering, frightened mouse between them. It all rang true. Dear God, do old scars ever stop hurting? Horribly, horribly true. Edmonds resumed. But things have changed. You know, schizoid behavior is a pretty common thing in children. It's accepted because all we adults have this unspoken agreement that children are lunatics. They have invisible friends. They may go and sit in the closet when they're depressed, withdrawing from the world. They attach talismanic importance to a special blanket or a teddy bear or a stuffed tiger. They suck their thumbs. When an adult sees things that aren't there, we consider him ready for the rubber room. When a child says he's seen a troll in his bedroom or a vampire outside the window, we simply smile indulgently. We have a one-sentence explanation that explains a whole range of such behaviors. He'll grow out of it, Jack said. Edmonds blinked. My very words, he said. Yes. Now, I would guess that Danny was in a pretty good position to develop a full-fledged psychosis. Unhappy home life, a big imagination, the invisible friend who was so real to him that it nearly became real to you. Instead of growing out of his childhood schizophrenia, he very may well have grown into it. And become autistic? Wendy asked. She had read about autism. The word itself frightened her. It sounded like dread and white silence. Possible, but not necessarily. He might simply have entered Tony's world someday and never come back to what he calls real things. God, Jack said. But now the basic situation has changed drastically. Mr. Torrance no longer drinks. You are in a new place where conditions have forced the three of you into a tighter family unit than even before. Certainly tighter than my own, where my wife and kids may see me for only 2 or 3 hours a day. To my mind, he is in the perfect healing situation, and I think the very fact that he is able to differentiate so sharply between Tony's world and real things says a lot about the fundamentally healthy state of his mind. It says that you two are no longer considering divorce. Is he as right as I think he is? Yes, Wendy said, and Jack squeezed her hand tightly, almost painfully. She squeezed back. Edmonds nodded. He really doesn't need Tony anymore. Danny is flushing him out of his system. Tony no longer brings pleasant visions, but hostile nightmares that are too frightening for him to remember, except fragmentarily. He internalized Tony during a difficult, desperate life situation, and Tony is not leaving easily, but he is leaving. Your son is a little like a junkie kicking the habit. He stood up, and the Torrances stood also. As I said, I'm not a psychiatrist. If the nightmares are still continuing when your job at the Overlook ends next spring, Mr. Torrance, I would strongly urge you to take him to this man in Boulder. I will. Well, let's go out and tell him he can go home, Edmund said. I want to thank you, Jack told him painfully. I feel better about all this than I have in a very long time. So do I, Wendy said. At the door, Edmonds paused and looked at Wendy. Did you have a sister, Miss Torrance, named Eileen? Wendy looked at him surprised. Yes, I did. She was killed outside our home in Somersworth, New Hampshire when she was 6 and I was 10. She chased a ball into the street and was struck by a delivery van. Does Danny know that? I don't know. I don't think so. He said you were thinking about her in the waiting room. I was, Wendy said slowly. For the first time in I don't know how long. Does the word red rum mean anything to either of you? Wendy shook her head, but Jack said, he mentioned that word last night, just before he went to sleep. Red drum. No, rum, Edmonds corrected. He was quite emphatic about that. Rum, as in the drink, the alcoholic drink. Oh, Jack said. It fits in, doesn't it? He took his handkerchief out of his back pocket and wiped his lips with it. And then I have this next sentence highlighted because I think it's a very funny sentence. Does the phrase The Shining mean anything to either of you? This time they both shook their heads. Doesn't matter, I guess, Edmund said. He opened the door into the waiting room. Anybody here named Danny Torrance that would like to go home? Hi, Daddy. Hi, Mommy. He stood up from the small table where he had been leafing slowly through a copy of Where the Wild Things Are and muttering the words he knew aloud. He ran to Jack, who scooped him up. Wendy ruffled his hair. Edmonds peered at him. If you don't love your mommy and daddy, you can stay with good old Bill. No, sir, Danny said emphatically. He slung one arm around Jack's neck, one arm around Wendy's, and looked radiantly happy. Okay, Wendy said, smiling. Edmund said, smiling. He looked at Wendy. You call if you have any problems. Yes. I don't think you will, Edmund said, smiling. Okay. So that's an interesting chapter. I don't think we learn a whole lot in it, especially because Dr. Edmonds doesn't seem to believe in The Shining, but the voice of the book seems to be pretty serious about The Shining being real, I would say. In addition to Wendy and, you know, really even Jack. But there is one detail in here. This is a sort of an unresolved puzzle piece that you're not supposed to completely get yet, that I want to go back and really point out. This is definitely something that I would like to emphasize as something that we need to remember for later. So Edmund says to them, and of course you two must understand why Danny's invisible friend is named Tony instead of Mike or Hal or Dutch. Yes, Wendy said. Have you ever pointed out to him? No, Jack said. Why should we? Why bother? Let him realize it in his own time. So there's this unspoken thing between the three of them, where they all know why Danny's imaginary friend is named Tony. They seem to all know why, and it seems obvious to them. But they don't think Danny knows why his imaginary friend is named Tony, and the reader is not told what this is. And really, from what I remember, you're not supposed to know yet. It's an open-ended thing, but it's something we should remember for later, because maybe at some point we'll figure out why his imaginary friend is named Tony. So that's a thing. I'm not gonna do a super long recording tonight. I'm gonna read one more chapter because I think this next chapter is a good place to leave off on, and then I'll see you guys all on Thursday. Take a drink real quick. Chapter 18, The Scrapbook. Jack had found the scrapbook on the 1st of November, while his wife and son were hiking up the rutted old road that ran from behind the rope court to a deserted sawmill 2 miles further up. The fine weather had still held, and all three of them had acquired improbable autumn suntans. He had gone down in the basement to knock the press down on the boiler, and then, on impulse, had taken the flashlight from the shelf where the plumbing schematics were, and decided to look at some of the old papers. He was also looking for good places to set his traps, although he didn't plan to do that for another month. I want them all to be home from vacation, he had told Wendy. Shining the flashlight ahead of him, he had stepped past the elevator shaft, at Wendy's insistence they hadn't used the elevator since they moved in, and through the small stone arch, his nose wrinkled at the smell of rotting paper. Behind him, the boiler kicked on with a thundering whoosh, making him jump. He flicked the light around, whistling tunelessly between his teeth. There was a scale Model Andes range down here. Dozens of boxes of crates stuffed with papers, most of them white and shapeless with age and damp. Others had broken open and spilled yellowed sheets of paper onto the stone floor. There were bales of newspaper tied up with hay rope. Some boxes contained what looked like ledgers, and others contained invoices bound with rubber bands. Jack pulled one out and put the flashlight beam on it. Rocky Mountain Express, Inc. 2. Overlook Hotel. From Sidey's Warehouse, 1210 16th Street, Denver, Colorado. Via Canadian Pacific RR. Contents: 400 cases Delsey toilet tissue, 1 gross per case. Signed, DEF. Date, August 24th, 1954. Smiling, Jack let the paper drop back into the box. He flashed the light above it and speared a hanging light bulb, almost buried in cobwebs. There was no chain pull. He stood on tiptoe and tried screwing the bulb in. It lit weakly. He picked up the toilet paper invoice again and used it to wipe off some of the cobwebs, but the glow didn't brighten much. Still using the flashlight, he wandered through the boxes and bales of paper looking for rat spoor. They had been here, but not for quite a long time. Maybe years. He had found some droppings that were powdery with age, and several nets of neatly shredded paper that were old and unused. Jack pulled a newspaper from one of the bundles and glanced down at the headline. Johnson promises orderly transition. Says work begun by JFK will go forward in coming year. The paper was the Rocky Mountain News, dated December 19th, 1963. He dropped it back onto its pile. He supposed that he was fascinated by that commonplace sense of history that anyone can feel glancing through the fresh news of 10 or 20 years ago. He found gaps in the pile of newspapers and records, nothing from 1937 to 1945, from 1957 to 1960, or from 1962 to 1963, periods when the hotel had been closed, he guessed. But it had been between suckers, grabbing for the brass ring. Ullman's explanations of the Overlook's checkered career still didn't quite ring true to him. It seemed that the Overlook's spectacular location alone should have guaranteed its continuing success. There had always been an American jet set, even before jets were invented, and it seemed to Jack that the Overlook should have been one of the bases they touched in their migrations. It even sounded right. The Waldorf in May, the Bar Harbor House in June and July, the Overlook in August and early September, before moving on to Bermuda, Havana, Rio, wherever. He found a pile of old desk registers and they bored him out. Nelson Rockefeller in 1950, Henry Ford and family in 1927, John Harlow in 1930, Clark Gable and Carol Lombard. In 1956, the whole top floor had been taken for a week by Darrell F. Zanuck and party. The money must have rolled down the corridors into the cash registers like 20th century Comstock load. The management must have been spectacularly bad. There was history here, all right, not just in newspaper headlines. It was buried between the entries in these ledgers and account books and room service chits where you couldn't quite see it. In 1922, Warren G. Harding had ordered a whole salmon at 10 o'clock in the evening and a case of Coors beer. But whom had he been eating and drinking with? Had it been a poker game? A strategy session? What? Jack glanced at his watch and was surprised to see that 45 minutes had somehow slipped by since he had come down here. His hands and arms were grimy, and he probably smelled bad. He decided to go up and take a shower before Wendy and Danny got back. He walked slowly between the mountains of paper, his mind alive and ticking over possibilities in a speedy way that felt exhilarating. He hadn't felt this way in years. It suddenly seemed that the book he had semi-jokingly promised himself might really happen. It might even be right here, buried in these untidy heaps of paper. It could be a work of fiction, or history, or both. A long book exploding out of this central place in 100 directions. He stood beneath the cobwebby light, took his handkerchief from his back pocket, and without thinking, scrubbed his lips with it. And that was when he saw the scrapbook. A pile of 5 boxes stood on his left, with some tottering Pisa. The one on top was stuffed with more invoices and ledgers. Balanced on top of those, keeping its angle in repose for who knew how many years, was a thick scrapbook with white leather covers, its pages bound with 2 hanks of gold string that had been tied along the binding in gaudy bows. Bose, Gaudy Bose. That's the same one that Danny described in his last vision, you may notice. Curious, he went over and took it down. The top cover was thick with dust. He held it on a plane at lip level, blew the dust off in a cloud, and opened it. As he did so, a card fluttered out, and he grabbed it in midair before it could fall to the stone floor. It was rich and creamy, dominated by a raised engraving of the Overlook, with every window alight. The lawn and playground were decorated with glowing Japanese lanterns. It looked almost as though you could step right into it, an Overlook hotel that had existed 30 years ago. Horace M. DeWent requests the pleasure of your company at a masked ball to celebrate the grand opening of the Overlook Hotel. Dinner will be served at 8 p.m. Unmasking and dancing at midnight, August 29th, 1945. RSVP. Dinner at 8. Unmasking at midnight. He could almost see them in the dining room, the richest men in America and their women. Tuxedos and glimmering starched shirts, evening gowns, the band playing, gleaming high-heeled pumps, the clink of glasses, the jocund pop of champagne corks. The war was over, or almost over. The future lay ahead, clean and shining. America was the colossus of the world, and at last she knew and accepted it. And later at midnight, DeWent himself, crying, "Unmask! Unmask! The mask's coming off, and the Red Death held sway over all." He frowned. What left field did that come out of? That was Poe, the great American hack. And surely the Overlook, this shining, glowing overlook on the invitation he held in his hands, was the furthest cry from E.A. Poe imaginable. He put the invitation back and turned to the next page, a paste-up from one of the Denver papers, scratched beneath the date May 15th, 1947. Posh Mountain Resort reopens with stellar guest register. DeWent says Overlook will be the showplace of the world, by David Felton, features editor. The Overlook Hotel has been opened and reopened in its 38-year history, but rarely with such style and dash as thus promised by Horace DeWent, the mysterious California millionaire who is the latest owner of the hostelry. DeWent, who makes no secret of having sunk more than $1 million into his newest venture, and some say the figure is closer to $3 million, says that the new Overlook will be one of the world's showplaces, the kind of hotel you remember overnighting in 30 years later. When DeWent, who is rumored to have substantial Las Vegas holdings, was asked of his purchase and refurbishing of the Overlook signaled the opening gun in a battle to legalize casino-style gambling in Colorado, the aircraft, movie, munitions, and shipping magnate denied it with a smile. The Overlook would be cheapened by gambling, he said. And don't think I'm knocking Vegas. They've got too many of my markers out there for me to do that. I have no interest in lobbying for legalized gambling in Colorado. It would be spitting into the wind. When the Overlook opens officially, there was a gigantic and hugely successful party there some time ago when the actual work was finished, the newly painted, papered, and decorated rooms will be occupied by a stellar guest list, ranging from chic designer Corbat Stani to... Smiling bemusedly, Jack had turned the page. Now he was looking at a full-page ad from the New York Sunday Times travel section. On the page after that, a story on DeWent himself, a balding man with eyes that pierced you even from an old newsprint photo. He was wearing rimless spectacles and a 40-style pencil-lined mustache that did nothing at all to make him look like Errol Flynn. His face was that of an accountant. It was the eyes that made him look like someone or something else. Jack skimmed the article rapidly. He knew most of the information from a Newsweek story on DeWent the year before. Born poor in St. Paul, never finished high school, joined the Navy instead. Rose rapidly, then left in a bitter wrangle over the patent on a new type of propeller that he designed. In the tug-of-war between the Navy and an unknown young man named Horace DeWent, Uncle Sam came off as the predictable winner. But Uncle Sam had never gotten another patent, and there had been a lot of them. In the late 20s and early 30s, DeWent turned to aviation. He bought out a bankrupt crop dusting company, turned it into an airmail service, and prospered. More patents followed: a new monoplane wing design, a bomb carriage used in the flying fortresses that had rained fire on Hamburg and Dresden and Berlin, a machine gun that was cooled by alcohol, a prototype of the ejection seat later used in United States jets. And along the line, the accountant who lived in the same skin as the investor kept piling up the investments. A piddling string of munition factories in New York and in New Jersey, 5 textile mills in New England, chemical factories in the bankrupt and groaning South. At the end of the Depression, his wealth had been nothing but a handful of controlling interests, bought at abysmally low prices, sellable at only lower prices still. At one point, DeWent boasted that he could liquidate completely and realize the price of a 3-year-old Chevrolet. There had been rumors, Jack recalled, that some of the means employed by DeWent to keep his head above water were less than savory. Involvement with bootlegging, prostitution in the Midwest, smuggling in the coastal areas of the South where his fertilizer factories were, finally an association with the nascent Western gambling interests. Probably DeWent's most famous investment was the purchase of the floundering Top Mark Studios, which had not had a bit since their child star, little Marjorie Morris, had died of a heroin overdose in 1934. She was 14. Little Marjorie, who had specialized in sweet 7-year-olds who saved marriages and the lives of dogs unjustly accused of killing chickens, had been given the biggest Hollywood funeral in history by Tupmark. The official story was that little Marjorie had contracted a wasting disease while entertaining at a New York orphanage, and some cynics suggested the studio laid out all that long green because it knew it was burying itself. DeWint hired a keen businessman and raging sex maniac named Henry Finkel to run Topmark, and in the 2 years before Pearl Harbor, the studio ground out 60 movies, 55 of which glided right into the face of Hayes' office and spit on its large blue nose. The other 5 were government training films. Feature films were huge successes. During one of them, an unnamed costume designer had jury-rigged a strapless bra for the heroine to appear in during the grand ball scene, where she revealed everything except possibly the birthmark just below the cleft of her buttocks. DeWint received credit for this invention as well, and his reputation, or notoriety, grew. The war had made him rich, and he was still rich, living in Chicago, seldom seen except for DeWint Enterprises board meetings, which he ran with an iron hand. It was rumored that he owned United Airlines, Las Vegas, where he was known to have controlling interest in 4 hotel casinos and some involvement in at least 6 others, Los Angeles, and the United States of America itself. Reputed to be a friend of royalty, presidents, and underworld kingpins, it was supposed by many that he was the richest man in the world. But he had not been able to make a go at the Overlook, Jack thought. He had put the scrapbook down for a moment and took the small notebook and mechanical pencil he always kept with him out of his breast pocket. He jotted, "Look into H. DeWint. Sidewinder Library?" He put the notebook back and picked up the scrapbook again. His face was preoccupied, his eyes distant. He wiped his mouth constantly with his hand as he turned the pages. He skimmed the material that followed, making a mental note to read it more closely later. Press releases were pasted into many of the pages. So-and-so was expected at the Overlook next week. Thus and such would be entertaining in the lounge. In DeWint's time it had been the Red Eye Lounge. Many of the entertainers were Vegas names, and many of the guests were top-mark executives and stars. Then in a clipping marked February 1st, 1952, millionaire exec to sell Colorado investments, deal made with California investors on Overlook, other investments DeWint reveals, by Rodney Conklin, financial editor. In a tense communique yesterday from the Chicago offices of the monolithic DeWint Enterprises, it was revealed that millionaire, perhaps billionaire, Horace DeWint has sold out of Colorado in a stunning financial power play that will be completed by October 1st, 1954. DeWint's investments include natural gas, coal, hydroelectric power, and a land development company called Colorado Sunshine Inc., which owns or holds options on better than 500,000 acres of Colorado land. The most famous DeWint holding in Colorado, the Overlook Hotel, has already been sold. DeWint revealed in a rare interview yesterday the buyer was a California group of investors headed by Charles Grondin, a former director of the California Land Development Corporation. While DeWint refused to discuss price, informed sources he had sold out everything, lock, stock, and barrel. It wasn't just the Overlook, but somehow... He wiped his lips with his hand and wished he had a drink. This would go better with a drink. He turned more pages. The California group had opened a hotel for 2 seasons, and then sold it to the Colorado group called Mountain View Resorts. Mountain View went bankrupt in 1957 amid charges of corruption, nest feathering, and cheating the stockholders. The president of the company shot himself 2 days after being subpoenaed to appear before a grand jury. The hotel had been closed for the rest of the decade. There was a single story about it. A Sunday feature headlined "Former Grand Hotel Sinking into Decay." The accompanying photos wrenched at Jack's heart. The paint on the front porch peeling, the lawn a bald and scabrous mess, windows broken by storms and stones. This would be a part of the book if he actually wrote it, too. The phoenix going down into the ashes to be reborn. He promised himself he would take care of the place. Very good care. It seemed that before today he had never really understood the breadth of his responsibility to the Overlook. It was almost like having a responsibility to history. In 1961, 4 writers, 2 of them Pulitzer Prize winners, had leased the Overlook and reopened it as a writer's school. That had lasted 1 year. One of the students had gotten drunk in his 3rd-floor room, crashed out the window somehow, and fell to his death on the cement terrace below. The paper hinted that it might have been suicide. "Any big hotel have got scandals," Watson had said. "Just like every big hotel's got a ghost. Why? Hell, people come and go." Suddenly it seemed that he could almost feel the weight of the Overlook bearing down on him from above. 110 guest rooms, the storage rooms, kitchen, pantry, freezer, lounge, ballroom, dining room. In the room, women come and go, and the Red Death held sway over all. He rubbed his lips and turned to the next page in the scrapbook. He was in the last third of it now, and for the first time he wondered consciously whose book this was, left atop the highest pile of records in the cellar. A new headline, this one dated April 10th, 1963. Las Vegas group buys famed Colorado hotel. Scenic Overlook to become Key Club. Robert T. Leffing, spokesman for a group of investors going under the name of High Country Investments, announced today in Las Vegas that High Country has negotiated a deal for the famous Overlook Hotel, a resort located high in the Rockies. Oh, it's the Rockies, not the Andes. Duh. Colorado. Duh. Leffing declined to mention the names of specific investors, but he had said the hotel would be turned into an exclusive Key Club. He said that the group he represents hopes to sell memberships to high echelon executives in American and foreign companies. High County also owns hotels in Montana, Wyoming, and Utah. The Overlook became world known in the years 1946 to 1952 when it was owned by elusive mega millionaire Horace DeWint, who the item on the next page was a mere squib, dated 4 months later. The Overlook had opened under its new management. Apparently, the paper hadn't been able to find out, or wasn't interested in, who the key holders were, because no name was mentioned by High Country Investments, the most anonymous-sounding company name Jack had ever heard, except for a chain of bike and appliance shops in western New England that went under the name Business Inc. He turned the page and blinked down at the clipping pasted there. Millionaire DeWint back in Colorado via back door? High Country exec revealed to be Charles Grondin by Rodney Conklin, financial editor. The Overlook Hotel, a scenic pleasure palace in the Colorado High Country, and once the private plaything of millionaire Horace DeWint, is now at the center of a financial tangle which is only now beginning to come to light. On April 10 of last year, the hotel was purchased by a Las Vegas firm, High Country Investments, as a key club for wealthy executives of both foreign and domestic breeds. Now informed sources say that High Country is headed by Charles Grondin, 53, who was the head of the California Land Development Corporation until 1959, when he resigned to take the position of executive VP in the Chicago home office of DeWint Enterprises. This has led to speculation that High Country Investments may be controlled by DeWint, who may have acquired the Overlook Hotel for the second time, and under decidedly peculiar circumstances. Grondin, who was indicted and acquitted on charges of tax evasion in 1960, could not be reached for comment, and Horace DeWint, who guards his own privacy jealously, had no comment when reached by telephone. State Representative Dick Bose of Golden has called for a complete investigation into... That clipping was dated July 27, 1964. The next was a column from a Sunday paper that September. The byline belonged to Josh Branniger, a muckraking investigator of the Jack Anderson breed. Why did I lose my page? Jack vaguely recalled that Branniger had died in 1968 or 69. Mafia Free Zone in Colorado by Josh Branniger. It now seems possible that the newest R&R spot of organization overlords in the U.S. is located in an out-of-way hotel nestled in the center of the Rockies. The Overlook Hotel, a white elephant that has been run lucklessly by almost a dozen different groups and individuals since it first opened its doors in 1910, is now being operated as a security-jacketed key club, ostensibly for unwinding businessmen. The question is, what business are the Overlook's key holders really in? The members present during the week of August 1623. Oh, the members present during the week of August 16th through 23rd may give us an idea. It's written here like a year. That must be a typo. The list below was obtained by former employee of High Country Investments, company first believed to be a dummy company owned by DeWint Enterprises, and now seems more likely that DeWint's interest in High Country, if any, is outweighed by those of several Las Vegas gambling barons. And these same gaming honchos have been linked in the past to both suspected and convicted underworld kingpins. Present at the Overlook during that sunny week in August were Charles Grondin, president of High Country Investments. When it became known in July of this year that he was running the High Country ship, it was announced, considerably after the fact, that he had resigned his position in DeWint Enterprises previously. The silver-maned Grondin, who refused to talk to me for this column, has been charged once and acquitted on tax evasion charges in 1960. Charles Baby Charlie Battaglia, a 60-year-old Vegas impresino, controlling interest in the Greenback and the Lucky Bones on the Strip. Battaglia is a close personal friend of Grondin. His arrest record stretches back to 1932, when he was tried and acquitted in the gangland-style murder of Jack Dutchy Morgan. Federal authorities suspect his involvement in the drug traffic, prostitution, and murder for hire, but Baby Charlie has only been behind bars once for income tax evasion in 1955 to 56. Richard Scarn, the principal stockholder of Funtime Automatic Machines. Funtime makes slot machines for the Nevada crowd, pinball machines, and jukeboxes, Melodycoin, for the rest of the country. He has done time for assault with a deadly weapon in 1940, carrying a concealed weapon in 1948, and conspiracy to commit tax fraud in 1961. Peter Zeiss, a Miami-based importer, now nearing 70. For the last 5 years, Zeiss has been fighting deportation as an undesirable person. He's been convicted on charges of receiving and concealing stolen property in 1958, conspiracy to commit tax fraud in 1954. Charming, distinguished, and courtly, Pete Zeiss is called Papa by his intimates and has been tried on charges of murder and accessory to murder. A large stockholder in Scarnes Funtime Company, he also has known interest in 4 Las Vegas casinos. Vittorio Gianelli, also known as Vito the Chopper, tried twice for gangland-style murders. One of them the axe murder of Boston Vice Overlord Frank Scoffey. Gianelli has been indicted 23 times, tried 14 times, and convicted only once for shoplifting in 1940. It has been said that in recent years Gianelli has become a power in the organization's Western Corporation, which is centered in Las Vegas. Carl Jimmy Ricks Prashkin, a San Francisco investor, reputed to be the heir apparent of the power Gianelli now wields. Prashkin owned large blocks of stock in DeWin Enterprises, High Country Investments, Funtime Automatic Machines, and 3 Vegas casinos. Prashkin is claimed in America, but was indicted in Mexico on fraud charges that were dropped quickly 3 weeks after they were brought. It has been suggested that Prashkin may be in charge of laundering money skimmed from Vegas casino operations, and funneling the big bucks back into the organization's legitimate Western operations. And such operations may now include the Overlook Hotel in Colorado. Other visitors during the current season include... There was more, but Jack only skimmed it, constantly wiping his lips with his hand. A banker with Las Vegas connections. Men from New York were apparently doing more in the garment district than making clothes. Men reputed to be involved with drugs, vice, robbery, murder. God, what a story! And they had all been here, right above him, in those empty rooms, screwing expensive whores on the 3rd floor, maybe, drinking magnums of champagne, making deals that would turn over millions of dollars, maybe in the very suite of rooms where presidents had stayed. Oh, there's a story, all right. One hell of a story. A little frantically, he took out his notebook and jotted down another memo to check all these people out in the library in Denver when the caretaking job was over. Every hotel has its ghosts. The Overlook had a whole coven of them. First suicide, then the mafia. What next? Alright, I'm going to stop there even though the chapter's not over because I sort of forgot this is like one of the longest chapters in the entire book, and it's not even halfway done. Yeah, we're going to pick up... continuing with chapter 18 next time. Whew. Yeah, we still got more than half that chapter to go. But this is a lot of exposition, so see if I can sum it up for you guys what we just went over. A reclusive, sort of eccentric billionaire type has been a long-time owner of the Overlook, but after he got rid of it, it was passed along through some nameless investment groups. Some of them expected to be connected with DeWin. You know, maybe he's keeping his hold on it through a back channel type of thing. But right now, at the point in the history of the timeline we're in, it has fallen into the hands of a group that made it a relaxation club and possibly money laundering scheme for mobsters. Some fucking famous ones, too. Some of the most powerful men in the West. So, Jack is totally enthralled by that, and the more he reads it, the more he wants to wipe his lips. You know, something's going on there, obviously. He's enthralled by the book that Danny warned him against in his vision. It's making his drinking habits come back. He's stuck on every page. You know, you might say, this is kind of my theory here, is that as a former alcoholic, Jack sort of has an addictive personality. You know, he's getting addicted to this book in a way that is literally bringing out his old physical habits from drug use. So, that's crazy. We're going to have a lot to talk about on Thursday. I'm excited. Bring your questions, bring your comments, bring your theories, bring all of it. Like, please. And starting then, we will be on halfway through chapter 18. And we will be getting into some more interesting stuff next time. I'm thinking about what we're going to read next time. And it's going to be a little rough, I think. In a good way. It's not really in a good way, but like good artistically, good narratively. Some rough stuff is headed our way, so that's exciting. Thank you for listening, and I will see you on Thursday. Bye-bye.